Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Dar al-Athar Islamiyya welcomes Professor Nizar al-Sayyad, who will discuss tonight the role of the built environment in changing societies and the relationship between dominant and dominated nations. In doing so, he will examine 4 historical periods and 4 accompanying forms of settlements which reflect the rising awareness of national identity and its relationship to the built environment, especially in the Arab and Muslim communities. Professor Nizar al-Sayyad is an architect, planner, urban historian, and educator. He teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, where he also chaired the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Middle Eastern undergraduate program, and the International and Area Studies graduate program. He writes extensively with 2 books in progress due to be published in 2014 and 2015. And before we start our lecture tonight, I would advise you please to turn off your mobiles and avoid as much as you can taking flash photography. Now let's welcome Professor Sayyad.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here and being here on time. I come from the University of California, Berkeley, where we have what is called Berkeley time, and it's always 10 to 15 minutes behind time. I'm delighted to see that Kuwait is exactly on time. I would like to express my appreciation to Dar al-Athar Islamiyya and particularly to Sheikh Hassa for inviting me to this lecture series. My talk today is an attempt to chart the transition of dwellings and settlements from early vernacular traditions to evolving forms in the era of globalization. With all of the talk of globalization, the interconnected world in which we live, we have to remember, is still constituted of national societies. At the end, there are states, nation-states, and the conditions of identification of individual and collective selves have actually become increasingly complex, particularly within the last 30 or 40 years. Of course, any theory of globalization must start with mapping the historical and unequal conditions of traditional societies, their colonization, their emergence as nation-states, and their intense transformation in the global era. I am an urban historian, and my stock in trade is the study of cities and spaces. And that is exactly what I will employ as my form of evidence in this lecture. Scholars have argued that the cities of the world, in this particular moment, regardless of where you are becoming increasingly homogenized, a trend that some suggest commenced with the rise and the spread of modern architecture. I will, however, suggest that despite appearances, urbanism, defined for me as the form, culture, and art of cities, may undergo little change in this so-called new global era. I will also argue that in the era of globalization, where culture is becoming increasingly placeless, urbanism will still maintain some relevance. I will suggest that urbanism will not simply surrender to cyberspace, and that it will continue to be a vibrant arena where it will be possible to observe how different forms of global domination are influenced, mediated, or even sometimes generated by local struggles. At the heart of this discussion is the question of identity. Of course, the connection between the identity of a people and the form and culture of the cities and the settlements they produce has been the subject of much research. Family, ethnicity, religion, language, and history have all been claimed as identity-constituting elements that are handed down in a process normally referred to as tradition. Tradition, in this case, is based on value and constraint. And in a technological world of limitless choices, the conflicts between the traditional and the modern indeed become unavoidable. However, to cast the traditional as pure and the modern as corrupt, or vice versa, is fundamentally naive. As much research has demonstrated, the traditional modern dialectic is in fact very problematic. In fact, even using the terms themselves comes with an entire baggage that one has to unpack. Dichotomies, for example, as East versus West, North versus South, We talk now about the global north versus the global south. First world versus third world. Core versus periphery. Developed versus underdeveloped nations. All of these may in fact be considered artificial characters. An approach which takes into account the discursive constitution of cultures would have to recognize that all societies are constituted and constructed in relationship to one another. For example, notice that the dominant term in each of the dualities that I just discussed, the West, the North, the first, the core, is mainly constituted and defined in difference, constructed in opposition to the other, and is not a monolithic, pre-existing entity itself. Similarly, the subordinate term, the East, the South, the periphery, is equally an invention produced in a variety of post-colonial and anti-colonial discourses. And to just give you an example, in Berkeley, I chair a center called the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And when people come to visit who are not necessarily familiar with the area study discourse, I always ask them that question, so what do you think of the Middle East? They don't really know exactly how to answer that question. So I tell them, well, tell me, middle of what and east of where? And there's always this pause. Of course, you recognize that the definition even of the Middle East has actually emerged from colonial discourses when, in fact, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire owned large parts of the world and ended up deciding that this is the East that is in the middle. So one may say then that there is no modern also without the colonial. In fact, if you even look at the literature, you would discover that no society ever called itself traditional until the moment of the invention of the modern. So the notion that there was a traditional society before never really existed until modernism and the designation of the modern came into existence. In studying the relationship between the dominant and the dominated, I have suggested 4 historical phases: the pre-industrial phase, the colonial period, the era of independence and nation building, and the era of globalization. I also suggested that each of these phases had accompanying respective urban conditions, what I call the indigenous vernacular, the hybrid, the modern, which includes also the pseudo-modern, which we see much of in the Middle East, as well as the postmodern. Before the era of colonialism, we had what we call traditional communities, and I put that in quotes, living in pre-industrial, often insular condition. Although some form of economic exchange existed between these two domains or two worlds, interaction and curiosity about the other was limited. This was a stage where the form of dwellings and settlements may have been an immediate reaction to the surrounding natural environment. Whether it was in a city like Hyderabad, whose skyline was once shaped by its windscreens that all faced one direction of the prevailing wind to be able to survive the tremendous harsh climate that existed in this part of the Indian subcontinent, as actually you had here in much of the Gulf with the Badir. The notion that each house almost has a hand, and the hand has to be raised to capture a bit of these prevailing winds to make it almost feasible to live in these conditions. Or whether it was the troglodyte, sunken courtyard dwellings, pit houses, if you will, which exist until today in many parts of China. I'm showing you an image here from Luoyang, China, where escape from this harsh climate went underground. In fact, if you look at this image, it's very interesting. This is an entire habitation. Each one of these courtyards is the size of a tennis court. And in fact, when one has to know someone's address, there is no address here. The entrances happen to be these staircases that take people inside where the house is around the pit. And in a sense, you describe your house by the tree that is on top of it. Or whether it was in a place like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia today, or much, in fact, of the Arabian Peninsula, where concern for privacy generated windowless exteriors and inward-oriented courtyard houses. In all of these examples, we encounter environments that are supposedly in sync with the immediate needs of the indigenous population. Their settlement forms appears to have been shaped mainly by the basic concern for shelter, and sometimes even by the absence of alternative materials. They reflect, possibly at a subconscious level, a match between the identity of the inhabitants and their lifestyle and the limited access to resources at that time. Now, all of this changes around the middle of the 19th century. Around the middle of the 19th century, the world witnesses the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the emergence of organized political dominance represented by colonialism. Under this colonial paradigm, the world becomes divided into two kinds of people and two types of societies. On one hand, administratively advanced, powerful, racially Caucasoid, nominally Christian, and principally European dominant nations. And on the other side, supposedly powerless, organizationally backward, traditionally rooted, and mainly non-white dominant society, dominated. The paradigm shift from the traditional to the colonial created a relationship of unequal exchange. It is, one may argue, as I have in one of my books under the title Forms of Dominance, a master-servant relationship. As this particular sketch, which comes to us from a newspaper that was printed in England called the Illustrated London Times in the late 19th century, demonstrates, where you actually have the white settler coming in, and in this case, the Indian servant serving him. So if we are to analyze the issues of identity, and particularly in settlements and dwellings of much of the developing world, we must understand the process by which this identity was ignored, was violated, was distorted, and was stereotyped throughout history. As a work of art, Jean-Léon's Gérôme's reception of the Siamese ambassador in Fontainebleau is a very good expression of this unequal relationship between the newly dominant and the newly dominated, mainly starting in the 19th century. In the 1850s, the Siamese, now the country that we call Thailand, were actually forced to open their ports to European trade and to exchange ambassadors with France. When Gérôme was commissioned to document the ceremony, he chose to paint a single moment in which the Siamese envoys kneeled down to the representatives of Western imperial might, in this case, of course, the French queen. Here, the problem of representation becomes very central, because much of these artistic creations contributed to the making of the other, and I would even argue to enlarging the gulf between the dominant and the dominated. Several art historians tell us that Gérôme was in fact the most accurate and scientific painter, end quote, of his generation in representing Oriental environment and Oriental people. But it was also Gérôme who gave us the snake charmer. A beautiful painting indeed, but one that depicts a nude boy entertaining a bunch of idle Arab bums in the portico of the Blue Mosque in Cairo with a snake. Clearly, this is not something that actually happens in the mosque. The political implications behind this artistic fabrication cannot be ignored, a matter which in fact led Edward Said to use this image on the cover of his seminal book, Orientalism. And now that the backwardness of this assumed traditional population had been established, at least to the rest of the masses of the colonial homeland, it became legitimate to go about reforming it in the minds of the colonizers. In some instances, in fact, the colonial regime proceeded to sniff out the ethnicity of the colonized cultures. When it even failed to do so by force, it resorted to the psychological technique of hypnotizing the middle class, as demonstrated, in fact, by this sculpture which still exists in New Delhi, India, in Gawa House, which represents the white settler subjugating the Buddha. The Buddha as a god, but the white settler is actually there with the white settler robe, and the Buddha is now paying homage. Obviously, all of this had an effect on the physical fabric of cities that colonizers inherited and changed. Everywhere they went, they introduced their own brand of dwellings and settlements. I'm talking here about the overall planning model that determined the pattern of urban development in both the countries of the core and the countries of the periphery, taking into account this colonial relationship. This was the era, as this very specific, straightforward sketch by the modernist architect Le Corbusier indicates, where ideas are supposed to flow from Paris down first to Algiers, which is the first possession, if you will, of the French Empire, and then to the rest of Black Africa, which also France owned at the time. The colonial era gave us a hybrid urban condition, and we start to see a certain architecture and an urban language at least at a visual level, that unified the lands of colonial empires. This hybrid often borrowed from both the colonial homeland and the indigenous vernacular. The example that I'm showing you here very specifically is in fact the bungalow. Well, you know, the bungalow, which comes from Bangla, which comes from what is today West Bengal and Bangladesh, used to be the hut of a peasant in this land before British colonialism. Ironically, it was actually adopted and it became the principal habitation for the British colonizers in India. It is, as it emerges, and in fact you find bungalows today in Australia and the United States and in Britain, as a type, a housing type that is very much admired and very expensive in the market. It is a hybrid dwelling type that one can argue is no more Indian than British, just like the Dutch villa in Indonesia was no less Indonesian than Dutch. Now, when the people of the dominative society started to rebel against this colonial order, they had very little to cling to in their drive to establish their own sovereignty, other than using the terms of the existing colonial order and the entire baggage of physical realities and ideological constructs that existed at the time, one of which was, of course, the idea of the nation-state, al-Dawla. Groups of people living in one region under a colonial power, possibly only having a common colonial history, but belonging to different religions, different languages, different ethnicities, and traditions, had to band together to achieve this new, supposedly more advanced stage of independence. The few commonalities were highlighted by the political bodies that were in charge at the time, while the differences between these different groups were actually suppressed in pursuit of the noble goal of freedom and independence. A national identity based on short-term political interest and the ideology of struggle emerged as the driving force behind most nationalistic movements, not only in the Middle East, but in much of the Third World between the 40s and the 60s. Once independence was achieved, however, the glue that bound together these various groups was no longer as pervasive. Indeed, the events of the late 80s and the early 90s in places like the former Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Now it's 16 different countries. And Yugoslavia, again, it doesn't exist anymore. Now it's 7 different countries. And unfortunately, in places today like Iraq and Syria, are a testament to the true association that these people actually have, where tribal, ethnic, race, and religious sect emerged as the prime definers of their group identity. Now, architecturally speaking, this third phase of independence and nationalism did immediately change the condition of cities in the developing world. During the era of colonialism, important and irreversible decisions that affect the production of the built environment had been taken and institutionalized. This notion that the architect or the planner comes in and erases entire parts of cities to build something new characterized this particular era very much. In the Arab Middle East, for example, new building codes based on Western norms requiring setbacks forced the traditional courtyard house totally out of existence. And I'm actually showing an example here from the same city in Saudi Arabia, where this is what people lived in. This is basically what was mandated, if you will, by the new building codes. Instead of the traditional courtyard house that is completely enclosed from all sides with very few windows, what you actually had was a villa-type structure with space around it. Of course, later there was the cultivation of trees, so on and so forth. But it actually showed the fundamental difference that occurred here. And instead, we saw the replacement with banal, single-family dwelling units that were not necessarily suitable from a climatic point of view, to say the least, because of a whole host of complexities. In fact, this modern type was often preferred by the inhabitants over this type, and ironically only because it looked modern, not necessarily because it performed better. In the meantime, many of these units did not necessarily perform very well. So I'll show you here two truly bizarre examples. When I first saw this, I actually thought it's a type of postmodern architecture that I had not seen anywhere. I later actually discovered that that was not the case whatsoever. I was totally flabbergasted. This comes from Al-Khobar in Saudi Arabia. I first assumed that, okay, the architect really knows what he's doing here. I later found out that these were common infringements on public property that as people were building, that were occurring everywhere. Because you see, in the traditional culture, people were used to a more fluid relationship with the public realm, allowing them to take over parts of that public realm without necessarily violating it. In fact, I managed to go into this unit, and in fact, the lighting bulb goes inside and then comes out, as you can see here. So I was really fascinated with what happens inside. It's behind the window. Well, you know, the owner was actually very astute. He decided to take this thing, he painted it red inside, and he made it a lamp with free electricity because he doesn't have to pay for it again. So the idea of taking it over without violating its principal function, hence the municipality cannot object, was actually a vernacular response to this notion that the city allows me to protrude outside. Why not do it? Now, the obsession with modernity, which accompanied the early years of nationalism and independence, was also a major characteristic of most new governments in the developing world, including in the Middle East. The Western pattern of urban development continued to serve as the reference model for the indigenous population, particularly the middle class, which was now running the bureaucracies of many of these new countries. During this time, the construction of public housing, or as it's called in many parts of Europe, social housing, was in many parts of the Western world an instrument of post-war rebuilding and of economic stabilization and of social welfare, if you will, during those early years. I am specifically showing you here a very standard public housing project that could have existed anywhere. In this case, it actually comes to us from Libya. It could have existed in Egypt, could have existed in Syria. It's the 4- or 5-story walk-ups that were built during that time. Below, I'm showing you the infamous Pruitt-Igoe public housing project built in the United States in the 1950s, which was in fact used to claim the end of modern architecture and the end of public housing as a public housing policy altogether. I'm showing that because at the time that Pruitt-Igoe was being demolished because of the failure of public housing in the United States, these units were actually being built throughout the developing world, and particularly the Middle East. Now, once these units were actually built by many of these new countries, some of them succeeded, some of them did not. But they encountered some very interesting problems. I'll show you one project which comes from Egypt. Egypt, under the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, which adopted both a socialist and a nationalist ideology, built hundreds of thousands of public housing blocks, all of which were actually rental. So this is one of the projects that I'm actually looking at here. Of course, once it was built and people were moving in, problems occurred. Like, you know, where do I put my chicken? Where do I put my ducks? And of course, more than that, the traditional problems of public housing. So actually, the slide that you see here on the left, this is an image that goes back to, I think, 1986 or 87. Because the government was not really maintaining the space in between, the resident on this ground floor in a public housing unit decided, well, you know, why can't I just go out and put some foundations and add a room? Mind you, this guy was actually paying at that time 1 Egyptian pound as rent. 1 Egyptian pound is like 5 fils today in Kuwaiti money. Of course, once he has done so, you can see the guy upstairs has a balcony. What prevents the guy upstairs then from adding another room 5 years later? And of course, the entire development started to happen this way. The essence of public housing in this particular project, and I actually had an image, but I didn't put it. Of course, you know, the government response is this is infringement on public property. So what the government did was send the bulldozers. And some of these units were initially removed. But over time, people figured out that they can outsmart the government. What they used to do is that they would actually come to the area where the bulldozer would come, and they would build a little structure, and they would designate it a mosque. Once they've done that, they've actually put an obstacle behind which the government would not be able to intervene. And this is, in fact, the image that you see of this public housing project. In fact, the only part of this project that you see today is this very small sliver on the side. Because everything that you see here are added balconies and rooms which were taken over by the residents, done completely on their own. The government ultimately gave up and decided to give the units to the people who live there. They don't pay rent anyway. It's as if you will, they own it. Of course, you know, what better public housing than public housing that is taken over by the public? It serves precisely its purpose. This brings me to the final phase, or the last phase of globalization, when the reconstruction of identity becomes paramount. For once independence was achieved, and once the dust from the struggle had settled, the problems of national and community harmony started to surface. Where it was not resolved, religious and political fundamentalism actually flourished. Of course, there comes a point in the life of all formerly colonized societies or people when they must cease to perceive of their colonial history as colonial and start absorbing it as their own heritage. When is this point reached? When did the forms of the British colonizers become the vernacular heritage of the eastern United States? When did the Spanish colonial settlement forms in many parts of Latin America today emerge as the traditional architecture that tourists actually go and visit, and they visit it as Venezuelan or Peruvian? Here, I would say that the relationship, or an interrelationship to culture, I have ventured to suggest that in all of us, individuals, communities, and possibly even nations, there are two conflicting sentiments. In the first one resorts to culture and tradition out of fear of change. A change that in and of itself may be inevitable. But protectionism against the unknown often turns into fundamentalism. The second sentiment, characterized by interest in the culture of the mysterious other, emerges from a totally different feeling, the desire to have choice, to merge with the other, and to share in a wider collective consciousness. The tremendous movement of citizens across borders and the rise of protected ethnic minorities demonstrate that the two sentiments, both legitimate, are not necessarily contradictory. In fact, they indeed may happen simultaneously or alternatively, based on time and place. Much of my own work as a scholar has dealt with these issues in detail in several books. In Consuming Tradition, Manufacturing Heritage, I employed the lens of tourism to problematize many of the assumptions regarding heritage and tradition in an attempt to understand how built environments are often packaged and sold in an increasing global economy of image consumption. In The End of Tradition, which was published a few years later, I argued that we have reached the end of tradition too. And by this I meant not the end of tradition or the death of tradition, but rather the end of our conception of tradition as a repository of authentic and hence valuable ideas that should be handed down from one generation to the other. For the remaining part of my lecture, I will actually concentrate more on that. In this era of globalization, nations find themselves having to compete in an ever-tightening global economy. They find themselves needing to exploit their heritage, whether natural or historic or otherwise, to attract international investors. Tourism development has consequently intensified, producing entire communities that cater almost wholly, year-round, to the other. The new form appears to be the outright manufacture of heritage, coupled with the active consumption of tradition. It is important to try to understand how global consumers today seek difference and hospitality as economic goods, and how producers or suppliers, often in third world countries, make their living catering to this demand. In looking at the heritage discourse in the first and the third world, one may notice that while both possibly possess equal desire to explore the heritage and the culture of the other, they have fundamentally different motivations of wanting to do so. These differences may be attributed or explained by earlier relationships of colonialism, political nationalism, or economic dependency. Today, as a result of such historical and economic forces, third world countries often wish to emulate the progress, in quotes, of the first world and adopt its developmental practices, but only without risking the destabilization, if you will, to the local culture. This is clearly a situation of wanting to have one's cake and eating it too. Thus, as Benjamin Barber points out in his appropriately titled book, Jihad versus McWorld, many nations want the traditions of the Veil, but they also equally and legitimately want Coca-Cola and the communication technology and access to the World Wide Web. Meanwhile, for its part, the First World appears more interested in consuming the cultures and environments of Third World or developing societies. First World nations are often the main advocates for and financial patrons for the preservation of Third World built environments as part of what they actually consider universal heritage, even if these countries' natives do not recognize its historical value. Now, the case of the two Buddhas in Bamiyan in Afghanistan under the Taliban and the destruction that actually occurred of them and the outcry that occurred in the entire world is a very good example of that. That, in a sense, the local culture felt that these are idols that should be destroyed. The entire world disagreed with them, of course. As the wealthy bloc, which often feels a sense of guilt and responsibility at times towards its former colonies, the First World has also tried at times to maintain or assist in preserving the dying or disappearing lifestyles and traditions of underdeveloped people and places. Yet, it also often is the case that First World organizations, foundations, and governments have engaged in such efforts, while at the same time condemning or rejecting much of the social and political practices of those societies whose traditions they claim they want to preserve, particularly when they diverge from Western standards of human rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. I think this is specifically the case in the countries today of the Middle East and of Central Asia, where you can see this discussion. What is it that can actually be considered a universal human value? What is it that can be considered a universal heritage? The example of the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya in India by Hindu fundamentalists is also a very good one to cite here, with all of the ensuing riots that occurred. As you all know, the Babri Masjid is in fact a mosque that was built during the Mughal era on a site that has some pre-Mughal archaeology, and in fact that Hindus consider the birthplace of one of the Hindu gods. The idea of the destruction of the mosque was propagated mainly by fundamentalists who wanted to claim this as, if you will, a Hindu site. Imagine if some Jewish zealots decide to destroy the Dome of the Rock. That is exactly sort of the offense that this particular mosque was in fact subjected to. As Kevin Robin has remarked, globalization holds cultures in different, contradictory, and often conflictual ways. It is about increasing mobility of culture, but it's also about cultural fixities. So while there is a sense that the cultural encounters across frontiers can create new and productive kinds of cultural hybridity and global citizens, there must also be a recognition that resorting or restoring or building can often inflame, as it has in these cases, further social unrest and division. Indeed, the great danger that lurks under this new global citizenship is the erosion of the public sphere. Today, and speaking globally, one may distinguish three types of places being produced with the planned intent of making them places for the representation of the cultural tradition of others. And I think I'm going to go into the last part of my lecture here and focus more, if you will, on environments that are not part of the third world, but for a very good reason, because technically they are attempting to capture historical environments from the third world and other places. The first type is actually what I call dream landscapes that replicate historical settings that are based on the notion of using history to create a Wizard of Oz-like place where all conflicts within a given culture are resolved and where all are reduced to their basic representations. In such a vision, all icons of a culture, such as architectural style, building typologies, spatial configurations, simply become the cultures that they are meant to represent. You're actually not looking at Venice here. You're looking at the Venice that exists in Disneyland. Authenticity here is desired and is achieved through the manipulation of images and experiences. The ultimate example, which is Disneyland, proves, if you will, that even if heritage is mimicked, it's simply copied. History still sells. There's also a second type of places where history is used, but where there is a legitimate claim to an authentic past. They attempt to resuscitate such places, which often are entire settlements or cities, by remaking them in their former image, may serve one or both of two primary motives: to attract tourists for financial gain, but also to serve as memory banks, banks of national memory, if you will, against change. Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia is a very good example of such an environment. It is a replica of the capital of the Revolutionary era, Virginia, and it is arguably America's premier public history site. Yet, like other history museums, its legitimacy depends upon its claim to a connection to real history, as embodied in actual buildings and actual artifacts. You can actually see some of them in this particular image. But it has also, colonial Williamsburg, long been criticized by historians and by many others for the same reason that theme parks like Disney are being criticized. In fact, some critics have called it little more than an airbrush, consumer-oriented patriotic shrine, end quote. Indeed, one may ask, as the park administrators in the late 80s and early 90s started to ask, where is the uncomfortable African-American experience of slavery in the narrative of Williamsburg? Americans are not necessarily interested in seeing this part of their history. And hence, that part is not always represented. So you can actually still see the slave, in this case an African-American actress, who's basically there playing the role, if you will, of the slave, of the very clean slave that is performing for the tourists. Santa Fe, New Mexico provides a slightly different example of that second type. Here, while the built heritage may be real, its meaning has long since been diluted. Thus, although the town's distinctive indigenous adobe forms may be historically inspired, they have long been disassociated from their original culture and historic context, so that now their consumption operates at an almost purely commercial level. It is well known that much of Santa Fe's authentic-looking adobe structures that you see to the right, to the bottom right, and to the top, are in fact simply cement-plastered wood-frame buildings that give the appearance of adobe. The architecture of Santa Fe accordingly caused one group of critics to label the town's particular style, to the dismay of many of its residents, Santa Fe, adding a K-E to Santa Fe. In this regard, one may in fact contrast what I call the fake authenticity of Santa Fe, possibly with the authentic fakery of places like Disney or Las Vegas. I'll repeat that statement because my entire book rested on it. One may contrast the fake authenticity of Santa Fe, possibly with the authentic fakery of places like Disney or Vegas. And I'll come to that in a little while. One might even say that places such as Santa Fe represent consumed tradition, but not necessarily manufactured heritage. The third type are nostalgic places which exploit cultural heritage in an attempt to normalize it for everyday life. The town of Poundbury, that originated with Prince Charles's fight with the British architectural establishment, is a very good example here. Basically, what you actually have is a town that was meant to give the feeling that it has always been there. The desired effect includes a long stopover in the golden age of 18th and 19th century before the advent of architectural modernism. Thus, all services, including telephone lines, electricity, gas, drainage, are all buried and completely invisible behind high masonry walls. It is all that is visible, protruding from the roof of a Poundbury house, is a stately brick chimney or a polished weather vane. The town is often described by critics as the product of a kitschy time warp. Yet despite its sentimental prestige of outmoded styles and small-town concepts, it has increasingly gained favor, both with residents and with writers and backpackers. As one commentator pointed out, the effect in Poundbury is polite, elegant, and as English as a vicar's tea party, end quote. But going beyond these three types, which for me typify the modernist engagement with heritage and tradition in this era of globalization, we find ourselves encountering two different articulations or moments. I call these hyper-traditions or post-traditions. For researchers interested in the study of heritage and place, the far-reaching transformation brought by globalization requires us not only to recalibrate the idea of tradition, but to substantially reposition it. This is so because globalization has intensified the process of delinking identity and place, and by extension intensified what I call the deterritorialization of tradition, challenging the idea of tradition as a true expression of a geographically specific and culturally homogeneous group of people. I use the term hyper here to refer to the social and cultural realms created and maintained through contemporary technologies of communication and information transfer that have radically transformed our notions of time and space. The hyper-real entails simulation. In the case of the casino towns, like Las Vegas, cultural heritage is indeed deployed. But here, the claim to history is non-existent. It is in such places that loosening the ties, or the loosening of ties, between the signs of a culture and the reference may be most apparent. Quite simply, to optimize the desire of the producers to manufacture cultural heritage and the tourists to consume it, it became common for both groups to simply agree to totally dispense with any pretension to reality or authenticity altogether. Just to give you an example, the number of Americans who visit the Eiffel Tower in Vegas is 25 times the number of Americans who visit the real Eiffel Tower in Paris. This made a lot of researchers interested, so they went and interviewed many of them. And the answer was, well, why do I have to see the one in Paris? I've already seen the one in Vegas. It's as simple as that. And while the real Doge's Palace in the real Venice sits on the Piazza San Marco, an adjustment occurs in its sister, in its desert sister, in this case, the Venetian, the hotel that exists in Vegas, where simply the palace happens to be a prime time gambling casino. Likewise, the Rialto Bridge, which was once the only pass over of the Grand Canal, is in Las Vegas found to connect two powerful gambling institutions. Unlike real cities, which often resort to the manufacture of heritage for political purposes, or nations which have willfully allowed the consumption of their tradition by others for economic necessity, Hyper Las Vegas is the ultimate simulacrum, a safe site for the consumption of the heritage of the other. Yet, before rushing to dismiss a place like Vegas as kitsch, one must consider that in Las Vegas there is no hidden agenda. Las Vegas presents the outright manufactured heritage based on the concept of copying the traditional forms of everywhere for the consumption of everyone who can afford it. In Las Vegas, the local and the exotic are thrown out of place and time and repackaged in the world bizarre. And this, in fact, leads me to my last concept, the concept of the post-traditional. The changes that the world has encountered have occurred against the backdrop of an ever-changing frame of reference. The idea of the global world was predicated on the premise of widespread prosperity, of the success of globalization. But it now may be argued that the globalization paradigm is no longer operative because its liberatory potential was never realized. Some see the events of 9/11 as a symbol of the failure of globalization and the triumph of local frustrations that it engendered. Indeed, the euphoric ideal of a global freedom has been replaced by the very real threats posed by globally unbounded and unrestrained others. It is important to recognize that the post-9/11 era witnessed the rise of a new paradigm, one that some have actually called the after-global. This is not necessarily a term that I invented, it's a term that I've adopted to inquire of built environments. Not because we've abandoned globalization, but because we need to move beyond its limitations. It is after-global because it supersedes the developmental era of multiculturalism and replaces it with the concept of unilateral dominant culture, the culture of George W. Bush, if you will. This is not an end to globalization, but it is the emergence of two different kinds of engagements that are sharply at odds with the vision of liberal multiculturalism, which I would argue has completely existed in the world until 9/11. Here, both religious fundamentalism and imperial hegemony, hand in hand, begin to emerge as the new forms of global engagement. Identity in this after-global era becomes increasingly complex as the connection between identity and place is no longer determined by heritage or tradition. Unlike neo-traditional settings that I showed, such as Poundbury, or simulated traditional places like Las Vegas, cities like Hong Kong or Dubai may be considered post-traditional places in my assessment. They are places that have acquired the global imageability based on precedents from elsewhere. They are places in constant race whose history is the current present. All this emphasis on the re-evaluation of tradition, its role in the production of environments, its demise in the face of globalization, all suggest its possible end. Indeed, if tradition is merely the dialectical fabrication of modernity, as I started with my lecture, then does not the end of tradition as a meaningful object of inquiry suggest also the end of tradition as an objective reality? The post-traditional category, and I'm showing you images that I'm sure you're all familiar with that come mainly from Dubai. The post-traditional category offers the hypothetical possibility for individuals and groups, nations and corporations, to choose from a rich display of traditions detached from their previous encumbrances with people, places, or even time. Here, the past of post-traditional places is not only invented, but it's also intentionally ignored in favor of an immediate present that is assumed to be the past. Dubai and its Palm Islands are an excellent example that stands at the intersection of this post-traditional condition within this after-global moment. Those post-traditional environments are not simply places of mimicry or authentically fake simulacra. They are places where the reference seems to be a fixed moment in history, related to places or nations where it has in fact become something that is constantly moving. In a sense, it is an idea of adopting actions and aesthetics from elsewhere. The connection to both history and geography is severed, and hence historical and vernacular styles become either irrelevant or relics of the past. The impacts, of course, on urbanism and on architecture is that cultural experience is becoming, in those cases, less place-rooted and more informationally based. I would like to return here, as I end my lecture, to Disneyland, particularly, in fact, to Main Street. For those of you who've been to Disneyland, I'm sure you know Main Street. For those who haven't, it is the main avenue that you actually enter through to enter Disneyland itself, or Disney World. Disneyland has a Main Street, and that street actually captured the imagination of all visitors to the park, for centuries, for decades, as the most quintessentially American of all places. That's what America is defined by, Main Street. But not just Main Street in Disneyland. In a twist of irony, the two towns that inspired Main Street in Disneyland, you can actually see here one of them, Marceline, Missouri, and Fort Collins, Colorado. One was actually the birthplace of Disney, Walt Disney himself. The other one is the birthplace of Harper Collin, who was, in fact, Harper Goff, who was, in fact, Disney's first director. Those two towns that inspired Main Street in Disneyland found themselves in tremendous financial trouble in the late 90s. They didn't know what to do. They had no tourists. Downtown itself was getting dilapidated. So they had to engage in a remodel job, a redevelopment job. The only way they can actually do that, ironically, the two towns decided to remodel themselves after their own copy. In fact, the idea was they had to better copy a copy of themselves to be able to continue to exist. To the extent that in both cases, the Main Street that existed in both of these towns, one was called Central Street, the other was called First Street, they changed the name of the street to Main Street USA, so that it actually reflects the connection to Disneyland. Here, the fake copy becomes the instrument by which the original can continue to exist. The fake copy becomes the instrument by which the original can continue to exist. It's very interesting because I showed you the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. The Venetian allocates 0.01% of its income to the city of Venice. Not because Venice is copyrighted. I think they made a mistake. They should have copyrighted Venice so they can make a lot of money. But they didn't do that. But the reason is that the only reason that the Venetian exists is because there is a Venice that people don't really go to. So in a sense, it's that connection that interests me. I would like to end this talk with a personal anecdote. In a field trip that was part of a conference I organized in Cairo in the late 90s, 1998, part of the conference was actually a trip to the pyramids. So as we actually went on that trip, and the majority of the people who participated in that conference were Americans and Europeans, and as we were standing at the Giza Plateau, just overlooking the Sphinx, I heard this American professor look down at the Sphinx and say, "Oh, but it is so small, it is so small." That's what he was saying. I overheard him. He was very disappointed. He was very, very disappointed. And his comment actually puzzled me. It took me a few days to be able to figure out what he really meant. See, it turned out that the man was actually a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where the School of Architecture happens to be in front of Las Vegas Luxor Hotel, a major gambling casino, built as a glass pyramid. But what is really important here, with an entrance that takes 6 lanes of cars. To be able to do the Sphinx, that's the entrance that takes 6 lanes of cars under it. The Sphinx had to be made 3 times the size of the Giza Sphinx. The professor was used to parking his car in the lot that faced the giant Las Vegas Sphinx. When he was in Giza, he became very disappointed. Not because the reality did not live up to its image, but because somewhere along the way, the reality ceased to be relevant altogether when the image became the principal frame of reference. Simulation here is no longer a referential being or substance. It is in fact the generation by models of a real without origin or reality. Of course, it is always in context that we have any reality at all. Thank you very much.
In search for identity most of the time. But why are we doing this? Why aren't we looking at this subject from a different point of view? For instance, why would Dubai borrow or have a simulation of Hong Kong, for instance? And why does Singapore did the same as New York, and so on and so forth? Well, maybe you can explain to me why we abhor these things. Why do we consider them degrading and its loss of identity? Why can't we just look at them as not building, but structures? And this is the new material that we're using, steel, concrete, and naturally this gives birth to something different than a building, which is usually made out of mud bricks or indigenous materials, earth, whatever. So vernacular architecture, I don't know why should it be in cities where you can have buildings, structures, skyscrapers. It cannot be applied. I remember Fethi saying that the distinction between building and structure, and he is quite right in saying that the building is the power of love, of man putting his hands into doing this, whereas the structure is the labor of machines. So are we going to be feeling guilty all the time that we lost our identity by copying? But how do you verbalize this? How can you put it in a context?
Well, I have to say that I think maybe the most important issue here is to ask a question whether buildings should in fact even reflect the culture of the places in which they exist. As architectural historians, as architects, or even ordinary individuals, have this expectation, which is you go to a place, you can figure out what it is. The great historian, Janet Abdul Islamic architectural historian, who actually just passed away a month and a half ago, used to have this beautiful saying: if you blindfold me and take me to any city in the modern world, I can immediately tell you that it is an Islamic city. And she went on to explain the sounds, the smells, the way people walk in the street, even sometimes the ad hocishness of the relationship of buildings to each other is a very specific indication of what this culture is all about. But I think you're absolutely right. In no way do I, or even any of the groups of people that I belong to, would advocate that what we have to do is build structures that project identity. What I'm more interested in is sort of seeing how we've come to a point in human civilization where the connection between place and culture has been displaced. It is no longer a connection where we assume that tradition belongs to location. It doesn't anymore. People can buy tradition anywhere, and once this tradition exists and is passed down to another generation or two in a place in which it was completely alien, and from a place in which was actually imported, it takes hold, it becomes the tradition of that place. And that's why, I very much emphasize, and I try to give a few examples here. When one thinks about what is it that was authentic at a given moment in time in the history of the nation, what was at one point in time so alien becomes, in fact, the heritage of that place 200-300 years later. So how does this process of transformation occur? When do a group of people become so interested in adopting the forms that they find as, in fact, foreign, but then, in a sense, becomes their own? Architects do have a role. So, for example, I would argue that Egypt in the 1960s had an architectural style that was almost based more on adopting the modernist architecture of Eastern Europe because of the tremendous influence of the Soviet Union. But ironically, because of the single-handed effort of Hassan Fathy, who didn't build much, but built in very specific areas and very specific things that were extremely well documented, a certain style emerged, and Hassan Bey's students propagated that style, which today people talk about, oh, this is the Egyptian style. So when they even see it in other parts, it is Hassan Fathy's style, but it's now almost associated with Egypt, if you will. So how is it that you create a structure that over time, even if it is designed by a foreign architect, it becomes the symbol of a nation? So in some of my own work, I talk, for example, about the beautiful building which was initially built, designed by the architect Ibn Khan in Bangladesh. It's a building that was actually built to be the headquarters of the government in East Pakistan. It is built in a classical style that is actually closer to Roman architecture than anything else. But then Bangladesh decides to split from Pakistan and become the country of Bangladesh. By that time, the building is complete, so they take that building and it becomes their property. There is nothing that is more alien to Bangladesh than that building by Louis Khan. Yet at the same time, over time, because the building is open to the public goes to it, poor people go to it, even though it's in a semi-island. The public appropriates it. So today, if you go to Dhaka, what you find is this building, which is called the National Assembly. It's on the currency, but it's what the taxi drivers put on their cabs. It is the main item that is available as if, in fact, it is the national symbol of the country. So it's exactly almost like, how does a building become a representation of its own nation? How does it stand for the city in which it exists? The National Assembly in Dhaka, Bangladesh, is not unique in that regard. The Eiffel Tower, when it was built, as some of you I'm sure know, it was built as the entrance of one of the Universal Expositions, the Exposition Universelle. And it was built to celebrate modern industry. Parisians hated it. In fact, they had several competitions after it was very expensive to demolish. So they were going to demolish it, very expensive to demolish. So what to do? So they had several competitions to cover it up. So they had a competition, cover it up with stone, cover it up with bricks, cover it up with whatever. The only reason they didn't do it is because it was so expensive. It was expensive to demolish, it was expensive to cover up. So they left it over time. Today, there is no Paris without the Eiffel Tower. So there's also something that has to do with the accidents of history. And how is it that what may have been intended by an individual or a group of individuals leaves a mark on a society? It's the society's capacity to adopt this symbol as its own, or not, or to reject it.